just in time. That's how you get out of a confined space in the movies. But in real life, you can't depend on scriptwriters to get you out of a tight squeeze. Working in confined spaces can be extremely hazardous if you don't take the proper precautions. Consider these real-life tragedies. Some tragedies take place in the home. A woman entered her basement crawl space to store some yard equipment. As she struggled to move farther in, she came in contact with an uninsulated wire and was electrocuted. A truck driver climbed into the top of a 22-foot-high sawdust bin to loosen the material from the sides. He suffocated when the sawdust collapsed and engulfed him. It was hours before anyone discovered he was missing. A worker entered a waste tank without testing the atmosphere. He collapsed immediately because of the unexpected presence of chlorine gas. A coworker didn't take the time to put on protective gear before attempting to save him. The two workers were dead when rescuers pulled them from the tank. The real tragedy here is that all of these deaths could have been prevented if the proper precautions had been taken and safety procedures had been followed. Of course, going into a confined space may not be something you do every day. After all, how many of us go into underground storage tanks, silos, or sewers? But sooner or later, just about everyone enters a confined space of one kind or another. And people who enter without being aware of the hazards account for many of the deaths and injuries attributed to confined spaces. In the next few minutes, we're going to show you some simple steps you can take to work more safely in any confined space, both at work and at home. But first, let's take a closer look at what a confined space is and the hazards it presents. A confined space has a combination of the following characteristics. It can be above or below the ground. It has a limited opening for entry and exit. It has little or no natural ventilation. And it isn't designed for continuous occupancy. Indiana Jones spent his career stumbling blindly into confined spaces. But you have to keep your eyes wide open, because recognizing a confined space before entering it is critical to your safety. What are some examples of confined spaces? Some common ones include crawl spaces, vats, furnaces, half basements, pipelines, septic and storage tanks, wells, utility vaults, and silos. What makes working in a confined space so hazardous? There are many dangers, including flammability, explosiveness, lack of oxygen, toxicity, and physical hazards. One hazard you may encounter when working in a confined space is gases, vapors, and dust particles in the air. And all it takes is a spark to set off a deadly fire or explosion. Another danger is oxygen deficiency. Insufficient oxygen can cause suffocation, which is the #1 cause of death in confined spaces. Another confined space concern is toxic vapors or gases. These can affect you before you realize it. And then there are also physical hazards to consider. These include bites and stings from snakes, spiders, and rodents. And other physical hazards like drowning, excessive noise, engulfment, which is literally being buried alive, and falling. Working in confined spaces can be life-threatening. The steps that we're going to show you will help you to work more safely in them. But remember that these are only general guidelines. At work, check with your supervisor and follow all procedures in the order that your company requires. At home, use your common sense and hire a professional when necessary. If everyone at work and at home would learn to recognize confined spaces and to think about the hazards of working in them before they entered, many injuries and deaths could be prevented. That's why the first step in working more safely in confined spaces is to evaluate the hazards. Of course, every situation is different. Assessing the hazards before you enter a confined space at home, for example, may mean calling your gas or utility company for information about power lines, pipes, and cables. It also means making a thorough examination of the space with a strong flashlight. Look for spiders, snakes, wires, loose dirt, sharp objects, stored chemicals, and other possible hazards. You'll want to determine the approximate size of the space, too. What's its depth and width? Is it big enough for you to enter and exit safely? Is there room to turn around? Or will you have to back out when the job is done? Determining the danger on the job will include taking all of these precautions and sometimes more, depending on your company's requirements. It may be your responsibility, for example, to find out what materials have been stored in the space. Remember, any material in or near a confined space can be hazardous. Even grain dust can explode. So be sure to note any warning signs. This type of information should be included in the blank permit you obtain from your supervisor, which will eventually be your authorization to enter the confined space. Evaluating the hazards is a vital step, as this work crew knows. For the rest of the program, we'll follow them as they prepare to enter a confined space. The steps they take coincide with the information necessary to obtain permission to enter. We'll also follow a homeowner as he prepares to enter a crawl space under his house. You'll see that most of the steps outlined in this program apply to working in all kinds of confined spaces, at home as well as at work. Just remember, however, that the order in which you perform the steps might vary depending on your company's regulations. Always follow your company's rules. Once you've identified any hazards, you're ready to move on to the next step, which is to review and understand the written entry procedures established by your company. Discuss the situation with your supervisor first. It could mean the difference between life and death. You should never enter a confined space unless you've taken the necessary precautions. There are a couple of other points to remember at this stage. Consider how you're going to get into the confined space. Will you need a ladder? How will you get your tools inside? Are there any other safety precautions you need to take? For example, does the space need to be cleaned before it's safe to enter? Once you have this information, you're ready to take the third critical step in confined space safety, which is to test and retest the air in the confined space frequently. Use the testing equipment required by your company, and use it as you've been trained to do. Testing can tell you what the oxygen level is, or if flammable vapors or other hazards are present.
Got it? Got it? How much longer? Company regs say we need to test 5 more minutes.
Yeah, any shortcuts and we can miss something. And remember, the sample's got to be taken from the bottom, the middle, and the top of the space.
Right.
All right.
Oxygen content in a confined space must be checked carefully. An atmosphere with less than 19.5% oxygen should not be entered without an approved air-supplying respirator. An oxygen-enriched atmosphere should not be entered unless necessary, because if a fire did start, it would burn violently. In addition, confined spaces frequently contain gases like methane, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, nitrogen, and natural gas. These present toxic, explosive, or suffocation hazards. If you determine that the air in the confined space is hazardous, then you need to take the next step, which is to ventilate the space as directed. Be sure to follow your company's procedures. This step is critical because continuous ventilation can both improve oxygen content and displace harmful gases. After you ventilate the space, be sure to retest it before you enter. Is the oxygen level adequate? Are the levels of harmful gases low enough? When you have the answers to questions like these, you're ready for the next step. Always follow required lockout-tagout procedures for all energy sources. Be sure to cut off, bleed, or disconnect water, steam, gas, or any other substances that are coming into the confined space. Then lock out and tag out all power sources so that equipment or energy can't be reactivated while you're working. Serious confined space injuries can occur when power is accidentally restored. At home, it's even a good idea to put a note on the switch or valve for the energy source warning anyone in the house not to turn it on. You don't want any energy sources like gas or electricity to be turned on while you're working in the confined space. Once you've taken measures to ensure your safety, like ventilation and lockout-tagout procedures, you can go on to the next step. Always get the permission you need according to your company's rules, and post the authorization permit, along with any others such as a hot work permit, outside the confined space so that others will know that you're working there. And be sure to take this important step at home, too. Make sure you tell someone, a family member or a friend, that you're going to be entering a crawl space, a well, or any other confined space. You want someone to know where you are at all times. It's also advisable to post a warning sign outside the entrance to the confined space to prevent someone from accidentally closing you in. You also have to check for physical obstructions and remove all potential hazards from the area. At home, this could mean sweeping the area around the confined space and making sure your entry and exit path stays clear. At work, follow your company's procedures and your supervisor's instructions. Now that you've prepared the space, it's time to prepare yourself. And that brings us to the next step. Always have a trained attendant outside the entrance to the confined space and in constant visual or voice contact with you once you enter. The trained attendant should be ready to summon help at the first sign of trouble. This procedure should be well established. If you're at home, use the buddy system. Have a friend or family member just outside the confined space. This buddy should be in contact with you at all times and know the emergency number to call if help is needed. But remember, this person's job is to observe and summon help, not to perform a rescue. Too many would-be rescuers become victims themselves. More than half of the deaths in confined space accidents are due to unplanned rescue attempts by untrained personnel. Now let's go on to the next step. This one's extremely important. Use any required personal protective equipment, such as a retrieval line, your link to the outside world. This piece of equipment functions much like the lifeline a scuba diver uses when exploring tight places underwater, like caves and wrecks. And like a diver, you may also have to wear other appropriate personal protective equipment. For example, the proper respirator. Failure to take this step, to correctly use the appropriate personal protective equipment, can result in tragedy. So be sure to consult with your supervisor about selecting the equipment needed for the job. And considering the nature of the work, it's also advisable to be in good health before entering a confined space. Remember, too, that you must be trained and authorized to use certain types of personal protective equipment. For example, a respirator. Now you're ready to enter the confined space. But wait, don't forget the next step. It's a lifesaver. Be sure the attendant is prepared to monitor the air quality to ensure your continued safety as you work in the confined space. Why monitor, even if you're wearing a respirator? Because your situation can change. New gases can enter the confined space, gases your respirator may not protect you against. Or the oxygen level may change, and you'll have to get out quickly. Never trust your senses to determine if the air is safe. You can't see or smell all of the hazards you may find in a confined space. And you can't tell if enough oxygen is present either, until it's too late.
Fine, but you keep checking that all the time. It's important. Safety first.
Okay.
Ready?
Gary, you all set?
And that brings us to the last step. Be alert to all potential hazards and expect the unexpected. If you don't feel well or are tired, it could mean something's wrong. Leave the confined space immediately. Remember that you're not completely safe until you're out of the confined space. Your awareness of your surroundings, whether at home or at work, could save your life. Help prevent accidents by taking the proper precautions. Remember, never enter a confined space until you have considered every hazard. And one more thing. Don't create your own hazards. Never smoke, eat, or drink in any confined space. Smoking could cause an explosion, and food and drink can be easily contaminated. Now let's review the basic steps you need to follow in order to work more safely in any confined space. Step 1 is to recognize the area as a confined space and to evaluate the hazards. Only if you recognize all the hazards can you be prepared to enter a confined space safely. The next step is to make sure you review all written entry procedures. Find out the precautions your company and the particular situation require. Test and retest the air. Remember, you can't see or smell all the airborne hazards, and you can't determine the oxygen level without test equipment. The fourth step is to ventilate the space according to instructions. This way you can displace dangerous vapors and gases and provide fresh air for breathing. Then follow lockout, tagout, and cutoff procedures. You want to make sure that energy sources cannot be activated while you're working inside the confined space. Get the permission you need to enter the confined space and post the authorization permit outside. Never enter a confined space without checking with the proper authorities. The next step is to guard against other potential hazards in the immediate area. Anything that could create a hazard while you're inside must be removed or guarded against. Always have a trained attendant nearby to summon help if you run into trouble. There should be at least one person right at the entrance to the confined space in continuous contact with you. Also, remember to use all of the personal protective equipment required for your safety. That always includes a retrieval line and often a respirator, as well as any other protection required by your company. Then, have the attendant monitor the air quality. The atmosphere in a confined space can change while you're working, and often the only way you'll know is by using the proper test equipment to detect the changes. And finally, be alert to all potential hazards you may encounter when you're working in a confined space. Always expect the unexpected. You can never be too careful. It all comes down to this. Think before you enter any confined space. In order for you to work more safely, both at work and at home, make sure that you understand and follow all of the steps outlined in this program. Because when it comes to safety, there's no easy way out.